Hey everyone, well, welcome back for part two of this series as I talk about the relationship between World War I and Christian theology, how it's developed continuing into our modern time. Many of the voices that are shaped in the First World War play a significant role in our continued conversations around Christianity, around who God is, who Jesus is. For those of y'all who missed or haven't watched the video from yesterday, I'll do a quick kind of recap of why, or what I'm talking about, why I think it's important. What I'm talking about through the next few days as we do this series is the relationship between the First World War and how Christians chose to approach war, and often the ways in which they used Jesus to justify their responses, which were all over the map. There are a number of reasons for this, one of which is we are shaped by our experiences. So if we grow up being taught to think of things one particular way or take a verse or an idea one specific way, then that tends to be embedded into us. And we can go through life without questioning it, functioning off of the knowledge and our view that it is true no matter what. And the same can be said of somebody who takes a completely different approach, taught their whole life to view it a certain way. It goes unquestioned. We read passages or statements from the Bible or from ministers and teachers and never think that maybe, just maybe, we should ask a deeper question about what's being said. We see a ton of this in the First World War. There are a number of reasons when talking about Christianity is important in regards to the First World War. In the last video I mentioned the significant relationship between a number of the combatant nations and an official Christian denomination in their countries. We're talking about how the king in England is also the head of the Anglican Church, how the Tsar in Russia is also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, how Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany is head of the National German Lutheran Church, and has significant influence there. And then some other nations that are a part of the war that don't have an official Christian designation, the United States, who comes in several years in, or France in the beginning, who, even though would consider themselves diehard secularists at the time of the war, have a significant Catholic background and still have some prominent theologians that are very much French at the time, and people who are prosecuting the war from the French side who are devout Christians, though not as many as some of the other nations. So today specifically, what I am... Hold on just a second. Hey Hunter, come here. What? You want a snack? Can you go talk to Mama? Hold on. Come here first.
Okay.
Oh, can you say hi to everybody?
Hi, everybody.
Can you tell them what you're about to have for a snack? What do you want?
Bread.
You want bread. Mama, he wants bread. If you want to know more about that, please go to my Facebook page and see notes on how to make bread, which we did last night in video form. All right, now that that's taken care of, today what we're going to be talking about is what the kind of general Christian thought, the consensus of the people in Germany about who Jesus was and what that means for Christian faith looked like in the lead up to the war. There are a few things that are probably helpful for you to know if you are not someone who's got a background in Christian theology and its historical development. One of those things that would be important to know is that Germany is sort of the heart of theological thought during the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. If you are somebody who reads historical theology, you'll know the names of Schleiermacher and Ritschl and Hegel and some of the people who've been very influential voices there. Enough so that one of the books that I read in the course of my paper is written by a guy named J.P. Bang. And he is, if I'm remembering correctly, Norwegian. He's from... Oh, no, it was written in Denmark. He's Danish. Sorry, I spaced there for a second. And he writes a book that collects a number of the statements publicly written or given by German ministers in small country churches to professors in large major theological universities in Germany during the early and middle parts of the war. And he's highly critical, as you can imagine he would be, of how they speak of God and of Jesus as national property, the German God, the German Jesus. But before he ever gets to the criticisms that he has to level, he spends several pages lauding German theological commitment. He may not find a way to respect what they say, and I certainly agree with him, but he outlines just how important German theologians are to the development of Christianity, and I think development of Christian thought in the modern world, and I don't think he undersells it. They are incredibly important and continue to shape thought today, which is why this was a topic that I wanted to write about and now want to talk about. So here's the way that goes, without me going too far into the weeds on names and thoughts of people that you probably don't care all that much about, and probably don't want to take the time to dive in and read big pieces of German theology translated poorly into English 100 years ago, which I've got a handful of those books laying around should you want it. By the time we get to the First World War, we've had about 200 years of German thought about who Jesus is specifically, developing in a very particular direction that is wound up and wrapped up well in a guy towards the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, named Adolf von Harnack. And without telling you every step of the process, by the time we get to von Harnack, who has learned from his teachers, who learned from their teachers, who learned from their teachers, over the past couple hundred years and kind of added developments and twists, we reach the point where the consensus of German theologians and what they are teaching the people, so therefore the consensus Christology of the nation of Germany. Now I'll pause. Don't take that to mean that everybody automatically believed this to a T, but this is kind of the guiding principle that's held. Is that whether or not Jesus was divine is unimportant, and in fact, Adolf von Harnack would argue that Jesus was absolutely not, that was claims made by early followers in order to spread the influence. Harnack doesn't... Hold on, interruption again. Yes? Hug? You want to hug? Do you want to say hi to our friends through the camera too? Is that really the reason you came in here?
Hi, Katie.
Do you think Katie's watching me lecture about church history? Maybe so. All right, hi, Katie.
Hi, Katie.
All right, go. We reach the point where what Harnack argues Jesus' purpose was, and the way, though he still believes Jesus saves, not certainly in the way that it has been talked about in mainstream circles in our days, he would argue that salvation from Jesus comes because Jesus serves as a model for personal piety. That the most important development of Christianity isn't found in Jesus. He says that directly, that Jesus is not even the center of Christianity, but that personal, pious dedication to God is. And there's argument to be made about whether or not that can be separated, and I'm not going to dive into that at this moment. More just to say that's where they've ended up. So to summarize what that looks like in practical application, the general thought of German theologians by the time we reach von Harnack is that personal dedication, prayer, being kind to your immediate neighbor, and being a good citizen of your community is what Jesus came to push people to do. There's a lot of holes in that explanation, but seriously, if we were to sit here and talk about exactly how he lays it out and what he thinks that looks like perfectly, we would be here for about 19 more video sessions, and even then I probably wouldn't be able to cover it all. But remember that phrase, personal piety, because that becomes absolutely central to understanding. Hold on, we've got kids fighting in the background. You got them? This is going to be a fun one today. To understanding why things develop the way that they do. The other thing that you need to know is that Germany kind of makes its move onto the world stage as a unified nation fairly late in history. And if you want to understand the historical animosity between the Germans and the French, other than the fact that they share a border and have been fighting with each other for a long time, just remember that in 1871 or 2, when the German nation is officially proclaimed, they go from a bunch of independent states that kind of work together to being a unified country. That comes when they are signing a peace treaty, having just routed the French army, and they are proclaimed as a nation in the French Palace of Versailles. So if you want to know what it looks like to rub salt in the wound, I believe that's a functional definition. We're going to proclaim our superiority over you in the middle of your defeat in one of your most important national civic shrines, your palace. And we're going to take some of your land while we're at it, because why not? That's what we do. And so Germany is late to the world stage. They've got little sibling syndrome a little bit, especially early on. They start looking at some of these countries like little old Holland, who have got colonies all over the world because they've been a country for a really long time, and they've picked up islands here or there and did some important trading early on when the German states were, kind of not unified. So by the time they make their way onto the world stage, they're kind of elbowing their way in at the table. And the other people who have been there for a while, the big siblings, if you want to call them that, don't really love the fact that there's this young upstart trying to push their way around. So if you want to think of it in terms of sibling rivalries, there you go. So all of that is kind of going on. And there develops a lot of pride because it is recognized around the world just how important, I kicked the stand, just how important Germany has been in contributions to art and to science especially, and to religion around the world. Like I said, J.P. Bang, who is highly critical of what they say, can't help but start his book with admiration over just how dedicated, how studious, how scientific they are, and where it's gotten them. So that sense of pride, nationalism especially, infuses itself into Christianity and faith to the point that Harnack and several others like him argue that, and he's got an entire book centered on it called Military Christi. My Latin is not good, I'm not even going to try. That argue heavily in favor of Christian participation in the military, but he didn't write it for everybody else. He wrote it specifically for Germans, to encourage German Christians to jump into the army. He talks about how military principles and Christian principles are, I would say similar, but he goes beyond that and says basically the same. And I don't think he makes the argument even remotely convincingly, but it's convincing enough for him and for people who read the book to jump in. The pitch is essentially made that, and though he never directly says it, he implies it, that if Jesus were a late 19th, early 20th century German, he would absolutely be a leader in the military, because the principles line up. That's the argument that he makes. So we'll leave that there for a second. So because of this combination of youthful national pride, and maybe the best way to compare it is to think back to America's founding fathers right after the Revolution. You're still working it out, and you may be arguing with people on the other side, but you still know you're better than everybody else. You see a sense of that in Germany around the same time. And the other thing that happens when you make when you marry nationalism to Christianity is that you begin to think that it is your Christian job to spread your nation's principles and borders. Now, you can see a number of countries do that historically. I still see arguments along that basic line here in the United States today, and certainly you can find people who suggest that if you flip around the internet for very long. You probably know people who would make that argument pretty easily. I don't agree with that. That probably isn't surprising to anybody who knows me and is watching this. That's where Harnack lands. And so by the time war breaks out, there is a large percentage of a population who has been shaped to think that it is their Christian responsibility and duty to fight in the Holy German Army, and I'm not making an overstatement there. You see Germany's pastors and professors call it that, essentially, in order to spread the kingdom of God. Use heavy gospel language to communicate the message and importance of participation. I'll pause for a second. This is not unique to Germany by any stretch of the imagination. And when we do the video tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about mainstream thought about who Jesus is and how Jesus works in the United States before World War I, because we're just as guilty of doing the exact same things, and some of the language that gets used in the process is really bad. But what I want to make sure that we understand here is that there's a significant amount of influence in our lives that brings us to the point that we, weld together all of these ideas to make our decisions. And because none of us have the exact same experiences, the exact same backgrounds, the exact same influences, we will rarely come to the exact same conclusions about what this looks like. There are certainly people who carry with them shades of Harnack in Germany to one side or another, but don't fully agree with them. There are people who are pacifists in Germany who are not interested in participating in the military for religious and political reasons both. Just like there are in every other combatant nation. You can still pick up their diaries, read what they've written along the way. But when you have this stream of thought that is shaping a large number of people, it becomes an unquestioned truth that people just accept, either because it's convenient or because it's been taught to them their whole lives, or because they need to accept it in order to justify what they're about to do. And boy, aren't we a people who love to justify our actions. So all of this is going on. All of this is going on in the lead up to the war with Germany and the rest of the world. I guess I'll take us today through the first month of the war on the German end of things. So, in Germany, like I said, Europe has kind of been anticipating this war for a little while. The German army has had this plan in place to try to rout the French army just as quickly as they had in 1871. It all depends on timing. They have to do everything perfectly. And if they delay, once they set the machine in motion, even for a moment, you end up with all sorts of hiccups and problems, and you can't execute the plan perfectly. Remember, this is a time of 19th century logistics. Things are just coming into transportation is just kind of coming into its own. Most everything is still done by train. Armies have a handful of vehicles, but for the most part, you're still moving machinery with horse and carriage. You have no troop transports on the battlefield. You have to march everywhere. So in order to move armies that are modern in scope, we'll do this. So as Germany deploys, their plan involves having a clump of their armies on the western side of Germany, ignore Belgium's neutrality, march through Belgium, and attack France, where they don't have a whole lot of big forts because it's a shared border with Belgium and they're not expecting a war with Belgium. The wing of the army that's going to march through Belgium has roughly 1 million men in it. Some would push that number up to 1.5 million. So when the flanking force of your maneuver is 1.5 million people, and you're using horses and carriages and not yet built train lines to move materials and peoples around, you can understand why timing and logistics would be incredibly important in order for them to pull off what they've planned. So when the ball starts rolling towards war, everybody kind of pulls the lever at the same time to start mobilization. And this is true for France, for Germany, for Austria-Hungary, for Russia. Once those machines start moving, you're talking about a really big ship and a really tiny rudder if you're going to try to turn the thing around. And so everything is kind of mobilized and moving towards war well before the war actually breaks out. When Germany marches their 1 million to 1.5 million men through the heart of Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality, they try to make things go as smoothly for themselves as possible. And one of the ways that you do that is make sure that the people whose land you're marching through understand that to get in your way or disrupt your plans in the slightest way possible is absolutely unacceptable. And so if a couple of people from the town want to slow you up or serving as a resistance force, or a small brigade of the Belgian army blows up a bridge, then what you do is round up 500 or 600 citizens and massacre them all outside the town, leave a couple witnesses so that they spread the word that this is what is going to happen if you get in their way. German mindset at the time can be summed up by one of the generals whose names I blank on at the moment, who said the only way to make war humane is to make it quick. As violent as possible, doesn't matter, make it quick. So really, it's a no-holds-barred modern warfare in a world that has not seen anything like it ever before. The atrocities that are committed by the German army against neutral, at least when they marched in Belgium, are absolutely amplified and played up around the world to make it sound even worse than it was for propaganda purposes, because that's what you do in order to make your enemies look bad, in order to inspire your own people to go to war, to get your armies bigger. And I'll pause for a second to say every army that participates in this conflict commits atrocities in some form or another, on big scales and small. But because the German army marched through neutral Belgium, and because the world blew it into a massive propaganda piece, there are 93 well-respected internationally scholars, scientists, theological voices who create this letter that make this big public statement that Germany was right to do what they did in Belgium, that there was nothing immoral about what they did, and in fact, it was completely necessary. And if all the other people would have just stayed home and not brought their armies to war, there wouldn't be a war at all. They're fighting purely for defensive reasons. And Adolf von Harnack is one of the 93 who signs the document. Thereby bringing about an interesting conversation about what personal Christian piety and ethics look like in warfare. And Harnack's signature on that document lets us know exactly what he's thinking. That the lives of people outside the country are less valuable, that the most important thing is the spreading of Germany's culture, which they would consider innately Christian to its core, and that by prosecuting this war against the nations around them, they are participating in the growth of the kingdom of God. They're not the only ones who do this. Again, we'll talk about plenty of other countries who use the same language. The United States is in no better position. In fact, we've had 3 years' worth of propaganda practice before we get into the war in order to communicate the same basic message. My biggest point here, and I'll make it again tomorrow as we talk about the U.S. background when it comes to understanding of Jesus moving to the war, is if you are a believer, if you're a follower of Jesus, and you're looking for a Christian justification for your actions, you can take bits and pieces of whatever you want and match it to whatever you feel necessary at the time in order to create a message, and in order to justify your choices and actions in the process. Harnack just happens to serve as a model for what this looks like. He's spent, at this point, 30 years, 40 years, teaching publicly, kind of changing a little bit along the way, but arguing in favor of a unique German position in the kingdom of God, looking at the attributes of German culture as uniquely Christian, and as the purest expression. German culture is the purest expression of Christianity in the world. That's just about a direct statement from him. And if that is how you are thinking, and if that is how you are making your decisions, and if that is what you have heard, if that's what you've reinforced, if that's what you've been taught, imagining German youth that have grown up in a world shaped by Harnack's teaching, then it is not that difficult to march to war, point your rifles at your British, French, Italian, Russian brothers and sisters in Christ, and pull the trigger without much of a second thought, because Jesus is on your side. You okay over there? All right. And so the ways in which... now let me back up. Just a reminder, this is live, and I'm kind of stumbling my way through this because I'm working off of, memory and very few notes here. No notes, actually. It's kind of a dumb decision. I should have probably written this down and strung it out a little bit. The most important thing to remember is that when you look at the First World War, and I think this is true of pretty much any war that has involved Christians, and especially at this point when nations are still nominally Christian, whatever that actually means, is that what happens fairly often is that Jesus goes into the forge right along with copper and lead and comes out a projectile, something that is yours to fire at your enemies, to declare your superiority. Truthfully, you look at the way that Jesus is spoken of and used by every combatant nation. Germany's just the example I'm using today. Going into the First World War, what you see is people weaponizing Jesus to mow down their enemies. And in that case, the nation and its aims have taken a primary role, and Jesus has very little to do with it anymore. I think that's probably a pretty good kind of stopping point for pre-war German theological and Christological thought. Just kind of understanding how a nation can be shaped by an idea, and how national pride can very quickly become an idol, especially when you consider Jesus, you consider God, an important part of your national identity. The problem that we see there over and over again is, and you may have picked it up in the way that I chose to say that, when God is simply a part, then you've already missed the point. And I think it's fair to say, as you look at the war rhetoric of the German people and the German army, the German propaganda machine, the German higher-ups in leadership, the generals and the soldiers, top to bottom, what you see is this idea that... maybe we can take it back all the way to Crusade language. God wills it. They would adopt the phrase, and we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks when you talk about German Christological and theological writings and speeches during the war. They take the passage, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" and apply it to themselves and their nation, as opposed to Christianity, as opposed to faith. They make it a national phrase, and decide that God is obviously on their side and against everybody else. We'll look at some of the ways that the United States does the exact same thing next week. Again, for the handful of people that I know who are German, I'm not trying to pick on Germany as the author of all evil in the 20th century. Y'all don't have some great moments along the way, but I'm more than happy to argue that World War I is not a war of good and evil. It is a war of bad ideals in political terminology, or political ideals around the world. Some really poor international political relationships. Some people who haven't figured out yet just how costly war is going to be in the modern world, and think that you can trade maybe 20 or 30,000 lives for this piece of land from your enemies. And all of those things kind of meet in this weird place where you can justify whatever, however, whenever, and Jesus just becomes a part of that. All right. So hope that this has piqued your interest a little bit. Again, tomorrow we'll look at how the United States, even though they enter the war 3 years after it starts up, really participate in a lot of the same ways as far as language and religious language and usage in particular. We'll look at some pretty concerning quotes and sermon snippets from American ministers and political, religious thought leaders at the time in the lead up to the war. All right, cool. I think that's a good spot to wrap up. I will see you tomorrow. Thanks.